Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, Abiyas Hashem. Today we will be learning Daf Kuf Tzadik Amud Aleph. Interesting share today, in that today's share is completely Mishnah Berurah. There's no Mechaber, no Ramah. We're going to be going through a good piece of a very lengthy Mishnah Berurah that goes into a lot of the details of Moichik and Kaisiv. We're not going to complete it today. I guess we're going to be doing approximately half of it today. The other half is really on Kuf Tzadik Amud Beis. So, without further ado, our learning today should be as chus for Achedik Beis Yisrael, Hanasunu Basar Bashivya, Ha'imdim Bein Bayam Bein Bayabasha, Hamakom Yerachim Aleih Ve'yitzim Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'afel L'Oira Mishiva L'Geula, Hashta Bagalo V'Zman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be as chus Refuah Shalema for Yitzchak Ben Tzion Ben Dusha, Chavadasa Baserel, Rivka Bashira Leah, and Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malkachana, Gila Shifra Basi Lana Udal. They should all have a Refuah Shalema B'Seich Shar Chayle Yisrael. Okay, so let's take a look here. We're on Kuf Tzadik Amud Aleph. We're in the Mishnah Berurah. We're up to the Mishnah Berurah's third entry into his discussion here on Moichik and Kaisiv, which in my print is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 lines down into the column of Mishnah Berurah here on Kuf Tzadik Amud Aleph. Says the Chavetz Chaim. HaKaisiv ksav al gabe ksav. If somebody overwrites something that was written already, so he has characters written on a piece of paper, on a piece of cloth, whatever it is, and now he writes over the same characters. Dahainu, and the Mishnah Berurah spells it out. There's a reason why he's saying this. Shehe'evir kolmus al oisiyai saksuvim kvar. He's passing a pen. A kolmus is a quill. He's passing a pen over letters that were already written, v'chidsham, and he is renewing them. That's literally what the word v'chidsham means. The shirish is chadash, new. He's renewing them. He's refreshing them. Potter. The Mishnah Berurah says this would be an Issa D'Rabbanan. This is Potter Aval Aser. It would only be an Issa D'Rabbanan. It would not be an Issa D'Oraisa. Says the Mishnah Berurah, why? Deloy ahani midi. Because in reality, you're not accomplishing anything. Now, obviously, the Chavetz Chaim is talking about a case where the letters that had previously been written were clearly legible. Maybe you're darkening them, you're making them sharper, but you're not doing something significant in terms of writing because the characters are already there. So you're not writing them, they're already written. You're sharpening them, you're going over them. That's not significant enough to cause an Isser D'Oraisa, and therefore, it says to Mishnah Berurah, this would be Potter Aval Aser. Now, I do want to point out something, and that is that if you go back to the beginning of this Mishnah Berurah, this is Mishnah Berurah Eis Katan Chav Beis, that started on Kuf Pei Tes Amud Beis, and where the Mishnah Berurah introduces this lengthy discussion of Moichik and Kaisiv, his words were, Va'agav niva'er poi min hagemara v'hapoiskim ikrei dine Kaisiv u'Moichik bedavar sheyesh by chiyuv chatas. I'm going to tell you those things that are an Issa D'Oraisa and where you would be chayiv a korban chatas if you did them b'shoigeg, u'bedavar shu potter va'aser. And I'm also going to tell you the things that are potter aval aser, meaning that they're Isurei D'Rabbanan. He does not mention over here that he's going to tell you things that are mutar lagamri. It's very clear that the Mishnah Berurah is telling us what is chayiv, what's an Issa D'Oraisa for which you could be chayiv to bring a korban chatas, and what is potter, meaning potter aval aser, meaning it's not an Issa D'Oraisa, it would only be an Issa D'Rabbanan. So this entry over here of writing ksav al gabi ksav, this is something that the Mishnah Berurah says is potter, meaning it's potter aval aser. Dalha loy ahani midi. Continues the Mishnah Berurah. He says, Vahani mili shahaya diyoi al gabe diyoi. When is this true? That I'm telling you that this is only an Issa D'Rabbanan, not an Issa D'Oraisa. It's when you write diyoi using black ink, al gabe diyoi, on top of pre-existing black ink. Oi, sikra al gabe sikra. Or you're using a red dye, a red ink, on top of a pre-existing red ink. In that case, this is Potter Aval Aser because you're not doing anything significant. Aval, however, says the Chavetz Chaim, im he'ever diyoi al gabe sikra, but if you take black ink and you overwrite red ink, now the overwriting red ink with black ink was considered a significant improvement. Nowadays, I'm not sure exactly how to apply this. In other words, nowadays, there are times that you want something to be read. But back in the day, apparently, to write something in black ink, in Diyoy, over Sikra, was considered a significant improvement. Therefore, says the Chavetz Chaim, Im hever Diyoy al gabi Sikra, if you overwrite using Diyoy on top of Sikra, Chayiv Shtayim, you would be Chayiv 2 karbonos. This would be 2 Iserei Daraisa. Achas mishum Kaisiv, one is Kaisiv, because now you are doing a significant act of ksiva, because now you're writing the characters in black. It's true that they were pre-existing there on the paper in red, but that was red. Now you're making a major significant improvement. You're writing black letters. Now, it's true that you're writing black letters on top of pre-existing red letters, but you're writing black letters, and that's a significant improvement. So you're going to be chayv once for the malach of kaisiv, the achas misham moichik, and you're also going to be liable for the malach of moichik, of erasing, shem moichik b'ksivasai eshtei oisiyos hatachtonos, because now, when you go ahead and you overwrite 2 pre-existing red letters with Diyoy, what you're doing is you're erasing the red ones, right? Can't see the red ones anymore. You're erasing the red ones by covering them up with black ink. And you're doing it, almanas likosev, you're doing it in order to write the black ones that you just wrote. So you're doing moichik daraisa, you're erasing 2 red letters in order to overwrite them with black letters. So that's moichik amanas likosev. And it's also kaisiv, because you're writing 2 black letters. V'im hever sikra al gabi diyoy. But how about if you do the opposite? How about if you overwrite pre-existing black letters with red letters? In that case, says the Mishnah Berurah, potter. Then you're mamish potter. Why? The mekalkelhu, because now it's considered mekalkel. If you turn around and you write and you overwrite pre-existing black letters with red letters, then that's considered that it's ruin. You're ruining them. You're ruining the black letters by overwriting them with red letters. We don't consider it moichav amanas likosev, because the ksiva that you're doing is an insignificant type of ksiva. We don't recognize it as a significant ksiva. Okay, 4th entry. So we've already discussed previously that the ikar malacha, the ikar av malacha of kaisiv, you need to write 2 letters. So eina kaisiv chayv chatos, you're not going to be chayv chatos at sheyichtov shtei oisiyos, unless you write 2 letters. Avalim kasav ois achas, but if you only write 1 letter, afilu oisa gedoyla kishtayim, even if you write a very large single letter, it's so big, it's as big as 2 letters. Potter mechatos. This would be an issa daraisa, because chatzi shir is also min HaTorah. So it is an issa daraisa, but it's not going to be a chi of chatos, because it's not the shir. In order to have the shir for a chi of chatos, you have to write 2 letters. And it's not a size issue. That's why the Mishnah Berurah is very, very careful to tell you, it doesn't matter how big the letter is. It's not a question of size. It's a question of 2 letters. Remember what we learned. The Ikar Av Malach of Kaisiv was on the Kroshim by the Meleches HaMishkan, where they wrote 2 characters on 2 adjacent Kroshim, right, to match up the Kroshim. So in order to be Chayav Karbachatos, you need 2 oisiyos. But it is going to be an issa daraisa even to write 1, the chanal b'reisha siman, like we saw earlier in the beginning of this siman, where we discussed the isser of cutting a hair or pulling out a hair, and we said that the issa daraisa is on 2 hairs. That would be the chi of chatos, but even 1 hair is an issa daraisa, because chatzi shir asur min HaTorah. Now says the Mishnah Berurah, when we're telling you that you're potter from a carbon chatas, if you write 1 letter, that's true even if you already had 1 letter on a paper from before Shabbos, and now you wrote a 2nd letter next to it. So by writing the 2nd letter, you're now creating 2 letters next to each other. That's still not going to be a chi of chatos, because you only wrote 1 letter. It's true that the end result is 2 letters next to each other, but on Shabbos you only wrote 1. So that's not going to be a chiyuv chatos. Kevin de b'Shabbos like kasav el oisachas. Aval, but, and this is also something that we saw earlier in the Biur Halacha, Avalim bazeha ois hishlim es hasefer, but if by going ahead and writing this ois achas, you go ahead and you complete a sefer, chayiv, that would be a chiyuv chatos, and we said, why is that a chiyuv chatos? Ta'ahani ma'aseh tuva, because then what you did is very, very, very choshev, because you went ahead and you finished off a sefer, you completed a sefer. Now, it happens to be that there's a machlokes rishonim, whether or not this halacha is true only by sifrei kedusha, or it applies even by other types of svarim. And you can see this in Dirshu footnote number 54. It says over here, Ke'ein lashon zeh kasav Rambam. The kasav of Minchas Chinuch, there's a famous Minchas Chinuch who writes, Shemelashoyne mashba she'ein chilikim hishlam sefer kodesh sefer choil. From the language that the Rambam uses, that even writing only 1 letter would be an issa daraisa if you're being mashlam a sefer, if you're completing a sefer. It doesn't sound like there's any difference whether or not it's a Sefer Kodesh or Sifrei Choil. It doesn't matter. Bottom line is, if you're completing a book, if you're completing a Sefer, by adding that letter, that it is highly significant, and it would be an Issa D'Oraisa even to write 1. Me'idach, on the other hand, they write here in the footnote, Rashi Kasav, there's a Rashi in Shabbos Kuf Daled Amud Aleph, Shemeduber b'mi shehishlam echad michav Daled Sifrei HaKodesh, that this is only true if we're talking about one of the 24 Svarim of Tanakh, or Mashba Shedafkim Hishlam Echad Misfarim Elu. It's only if you complete one of those Svarim. Now, the reason that would be is because Sifrei Kedusha are highly precise. A sefer of Tanakh that's written on cloth, in order for it to have kedusha, it must be complete. So by going ahead and completing it means writing it properly, writing all the proper oisiyos and everything else. Now you imbue it with kedusha, so that would be highly significant. So here you have an interesting machlokes rishonim when it comes to this halacha that we just discussed over here. Okay, let's go a little bit weiter over here in the Chavetz Chaim. HaKosev ois achas, if somebody writes 1 letter, v'niked aleho l'siman, and he makes what we call in Yiddish a shtrichel, he makes an apostrophe by the letter, l'siman, which acts as a siman so that you understand that this is an abbreviation. And he'll give a scenario. Even though now you could have a scenario where you write 1 letter with a shtrichel, and now anybody who looks at that, they're going to read it as an entire word. Potter, this is Potter Avaloser. And he explains, Ketzad, Kigoy, Shekasav ois mem with the apostrophe, that's here in the text. So he writes a mem with a shtrichel. Va'akol karin ois a meiser. Somebody is writing something that has to do with meiser, right? Maybe he's writing a pirush on a Mishnah in Meisrus. And instead of writing out meiser, mem ayin sin reish, he makes a mem with a shtrichel. And anybody who's reading it understands in context that mem stands for meiser. So when they see that mem, they're going to read an entire word. They're going to read meiser. But you didn't write meiser. You wrote a mem and a little shtrichel. Or you made a mem with a little shtrichel on it in the context where everybody understands that you're using it to allude to the quantity of 40. So now everybody understands that mem means arboim. It means 40. Afilu hachi potter. This is still an issa d'Rabbanan, because the bottom line is you did not write 2 letters. So this is only an issa d'Rabbanan. I mean, I'm just thinking about it now. I don't think he means that this is only an issa d'Rabbanan. He means, of course it's not an issa d'Rabbanan. It's an issa d'Oraisa. It's not only an issa d'Rabbanan. It's an issa d'Oraisa. You wrote 1 ois. So of course it's an issa d'Oraisa. It's chatzi shir aser ben HaTorah. This is not potter avaloser, Rabbi say. I misspoke. This does not mean potter avaloser. This means potter from a carbon chatas because it's chatzi shir. You don't have the shir of 2 oisiyos. The Havamina was that since you're writing one ois at a strichel and it means arboim, or you're writing one ois at a strichel so it means meiser, maybe that's as if you wrote two letters, and maybe it would bring about a chiyuv carbon chatos. Kamash balon, that this is not a chiyuv carbon chatos, but it's still also min HaTorah. You wrote one letter, so writing one letter is chasi sher also min HaTorah. So this is not pater avalosar Rabbi say. This one is pater from a carbon chatos, but it's an issa daraisa. Okay, going weiter. Hamagia ois achas. If somebody amends, E-M-E-N-D-S. If somebody amends one letter, va'asa is a shtayim, and by making that emendation that he made, he creates two letters. How so? He gives us a case. Keep going. Shechilek gag haches v'nase shnei zayin. Somebody makes an emendation to a letter ches, written in Ashuris, and by doing so, he creates two zayins. And I will show you what this means. For those who are not familiar with Ksav Ashuris, I'll show you what this means. The letter ches, as it appears in the Sefer Torah, it's actually a little bit of a machlokes, different types of Ksav, Ksav Ari, Ksav Yosef, etc., etc., but the letter ches is created out of two zayins that are next to each other, two zayins with that little gag, the little roof on top that joins the two zayins together. That's how you have a ches. So what if somebody takes that letter ches and he goes ahead and he takes away the gag? I just struck through the gag, but he didn't strike through the gag, he erased the gag. And by erasing the gag, what is he left with? He's left with two zayins next to each other, right? There you have it. You take away the gag, you have two zayins next to each other. So did this gentleman write two letters? He didn't write two letters. Matter of fact, he didn't really write anything. What he did was he removed the gag of the ches. But by removing the gag of the ches, he went ahead and he created two letters. He created two zayins. There weren't two zayins there before. Before there was a ches. If you ask her, what is that? It's not two zayins. No one's going to look at it and say, oh, it's two zayins connected with a funny little teepee on top. No, it's a ches. Now, by going ahead and taking away the gag, he created two oisios. He created two zayins. So says the Mishnah Berurah, Hamagia oisachas, if somebody makes an emendation to one letter, va'asa oisa shtayim, in so doing, he creates two letters. He takes away the roof of the ches, and by doing so, he creates two zainin. And he wants the two zayins. He wants two zayins over there. So there was a ches, and he says, I need two zayins. You know what? I'll take away the gag. I took away the gag, now I have two zayins. So it's b'mechuven that he's doing this. This is not a davar she'eino miskaven. He's doing it b'mechuven. He's doing a ma'aser to take away the gag in order to create two zayins that he wants. Chayiv. Is it daraisa chiyuv carbon chatos? If he does it b'shoigi because he forgot it was Shabbos, or he forgot that this was aser. V'chein kol kayotze b'zeh, or anything similar to this. Now, you wouldn't be chayiv. Note that the Mishnah Berurah says you're only chayiv for this if v'hu tzarich lazeh. If you need the two zayins, you're chayiv. If you don't need the two zayins, this would not be a chiyuv chatos. Why wouldn't it be a chiyuv chatos? Because if you don't need the two zayins, then what you did was an act of mekalkal. What you did is called a destructive act, not a positive act. In order for it to be a chiyuv carbon chatos for Shabbos, it has to be meleches machasheves. It has to be a productive, intentional malacha. Over here, it's not productive. If you don't want the two zayins, then all you did was destroy a ches. We're not going to look at it and say you made two zayins, and I want two zayins. So you had a ches, you destroyed a ches, and now you don't have anything that you want, so it's mekalkal. If it's mekalkal, it can't be a chiyuv chatos. So that's why he says this is only a chiyuv chatos if v'hu tzarich lazeh. V'chein kol kayotze b'zeh. Now, the truth is that it would seem that there are two different chidushim over here in this halach. At least that's the way I'm looking at it. One chiddush over here is that here's a very interesting case where you are going to be chayiv to bring a korban chatos for the malacha of kosev, even though you're not writing anything. You're erasing, right? The two zayins have a gag, so that it's a ches. By taking away the gag, we're saying that you're going to be chayiv because of kosev. Because by taking away the gag, you're forming two letters. So you're being over kosev by doing moichik. That's one chiddush. Another chiddush that lies in this halacha is that the act that you're doing, the maisa that you're doing, it's true that you're creating two letters. You're creating two zayins. But the maisa that you're doing to one letter. You're doing the maisa to a ches. You're taking away the gag of a ches. So you're doing a maisa to one letter, which is creating two letters. And you're chayiv because of kosev. Interesting. It's a lot that's between the lines over here, but it's beyond the scope of what we could do. Just pointing out some interesting things. Okay, weiter. Hiskavein lichtov ches. Let's say somebody sat down with the pen and he wanted to write a ches. V'kosav shnei zaynin. And he ended up writing two zayins. So, in order to write the ches properly, you got to make a zayin, and you got to make a gag, and you got to connect them. But he didn't do that. He ended up writing two zayins. He never connected them properly. So, he wrote two letters, right? So, is this a problem? Is he going to be over kosev daraisa chiv korban chatos because he wrote two letters? And now he's got to bring a korban chatos if he did it b'shoigig? Oi, she'eskayin lichtov mem. He wanted to write the letter mem in Ashuris. Va'ala b'yadai chaf vav. The truth is that a mem, the letter mem, is created out of a chaf. I'll show you what I mean. That is basically a chaf, right? So that's the beginning of a mem. And then you make a vav next to it. I now made a vav next to the mem, and next to the chaf, and I created a mem. So what happens if this fellow went to go ahead and write a mem, and he made a chaf, and he made a vav, but he didn't successfully close them off. If it would be closed off at the top, it would be a mem, but he didn't close it off. So he wrote a chaf and a vav. So you could have a case where somebody wanted to write a ches, and he just made two zayins. He didn't successfully connect them. He didn't turn it into a ches. He wanted to make a mem. He wrote a chaf. He wrote a vav. He didn't successfully connect it. He never made the mem. But now he wrote a chaf and a vav. So he wrote two oisiyos l'chayra. Is that going to be a chiv chatos? Says the Mishnah Berurah. Hiskaven lichtov ches v'kosev shtei zaynin. Oishe hiskaven lichtov mem v'ala b'yad chaf vav. Al yedei shedileg akol me'es. The pen skipped. And he didn't connect the two sides. There's not going to be a chiyuv chatas over here. This, it seems, the Chavetz Chaim is saying, is a classic davar she'enim iskaven. I didn't want to write two zayins. I didn't want to write a chaf and a vav. Right? Happens to be that the way you write a ches is by making two zayins and connecting them. But what if it would be that he had kavanah to make a ches, and he made a ches. And he knows that the way you make a ches is you make a zayin, you make another zayin, you connect it on top. Somebody will come to him and say, oh, you forgot that it's Shabbos, you just wrote two letters, you're chayiv to bring a korban chatos. What are you talking about? I wrote two letters. I wrote one letter. There's a ches. I didn't write two letters. No, you made a zayin and then a zayin. Yeah, and then I connected them on top and I made a ches. So I wrote one ois. I didn't write two oisios. Over here, what he did was, he wrote a zayin, and he failed to connect it. So that's a davar she'enim iskaven. It's true that there are two zayins here on the page, but he never intended to write two zayins. He intended to write a ches. So it's a davar she'enim iskaven. If it's a davar she'enim iskaven, it's going to be a d'Rabbanan. Going weiter. Hey, shtei oisiyos shamarnu l'chiv, well, we say that you're chayiv korban chatos if you write two letters. Hu afilu im lo nasa teva al yedei zeh. That's true even if you don't create a word. For example, says the Chavetz Chaim, Kigoit, Lost the place. Keep going. Aleph Gimel. Somebody writes an Aleph, and then he writes a Gimel next to it. Ag is not a word. Or any other two letters that do not create a word. Doesn't matter. You wrote two letters. You're chayiv. Or even if you write two letters next to each other, two identical letters. Now, if you're a sharp, eagle-eyed person, you'll chop what I'm going to say after I read the next few words before I say it. Says the Chavetz Chaim, keep going. For example, case. Somebody writes tough, or really tough, and then a suf. But there's no difference between a tough and a suf as they're written in the Sefer Torah. There's no dots in the middle of the letter in the Sefer Torah. So somebody writes a tough and a suf next to each other. Or gag. Somebody writes gimel next to each other. Or choch. Somebody writes two cheses next to each other. Or dad. Somebody writes two dalids next to each other. V'chadoima, or anything similar, gam ken chayiv. You're also chayiv. So, what did the Mishnah Berurah just tell me? Mishnah Berurah just told me two halachas. He said, first of all, you should know that if you write two letters next to each other that do not make a word, like Aleph Gimel, which is not a word, right? If you write two letters next to each other and it doesn't make a word, it doesn't matter. You're chayiv for writing two letters anyway. So this is Daraisa, you did it for sure, you got to bring karbachatas. That was halacha number one. Halacha number two, you should know that this applies even if you write two identical letters next to each other. Tuf, suf, gimel, ches, dalid. You're also chayiv. Now it happens to be that all of the examples that the Mishnah Berurah gives here are all words. Tuf and suf next to each other is tes, which means to give. Gimel next to each other is gag, which means a roof. Ches and ches next to each other is choch, which is a bracelet. Dalid and dalid next to each other is a word, which means a nipple, a dad. So all of these happen to be words. How about if two letters next to each other that don't make a word? How about that? Hey is not a word, right? Tes is not a word. Is that going to be a chiyuv chatas? So the truth is that the Mishnah Berurah doesn't go into it over here, but that would be a machlokes rishonim, whether or not that would be an iser, a chiyuv chatas. One thing is for sure, everybody agrees that if two identical letters make a word, that's definitely a chiyuv chatas. But if two identical letters do not make a word, that's already a machlokes rishonim. Continues the Mishnah Berurah. Also, if somebody writes two letters, but he didn't accomplish what he set out to accomplish. A person wanted to write a word. The word has more than two letters in it. He started writing, he wrote two letters, and then he stopped. So he didn't accomplish what he set out to accomplish. Going, for example, titnu. So he wrote the tough and the tough, but he didn't finish off the nun and the vav. Gagois, roofs, plural. So he wrote gimel, but he never finished the vav and the saf. So you don't have to accomplish what you set out to accomplish in order to be chayiv. You wrote two letters, bekavana, b'mechuvin. So, okay, it's a daraisa chiyuv chatas. V'dan, you should know, says the Chavetz Chaim, the lefimasha nifsak le'el b'siman lamed vav, according to something we learned earlier in Siman lamed vav in Hilchas Tefillin, when we learned about the oisiyos of a Sefer Torah Tefillin mezuzahs, how they're written and what's required and what's not. And we said over there, De'ein haziyunin shelo oisiyos shatnes gats ma'akev. Shatnes gats is a mnemonic. The letters that make up shatnes gats, shin ayin tes nun zayin gimel tzadi, those all have what we call tagin. They have little crowns on the top of them. The crowns are three little miniature zayins. They look like three little marks that go on top of the letter. They're either called tagin, crowns, or they're called ziyunin. Now the word ziyunin, some people understand the word ziyunin meaning that they're zayins, because each one of those little three prongs, they almost look like prongs. But those three prongs, each one looks like a zayin, or some understand it as being from a lashon of weaponry. Clay zayin. weapons are called klei zayin. So these little prongs are called the weapons, the accessories kind of the letters. But we learned in Siman Lamed Vav Tefillin that these tagin are not ma'akiv. If you wrote a Sefer Torah and you didn't put the tagin on top of Shatnez Gatz, it would still be a kosher Sefer Torah. So based on that, it says the Mishnah Berurah here, V'day, you should know. The lafim mashe nifsak le'el b'siman lamed vav de'en as a yunin shalois yeshatnez gatz ma'akiv alma demikri ksav beloizeh. That tells me very clearly that when you write these letters without the tagin, that's still called a ksiva, right? Because it's kosher even without it. Im kain, if so, im kaiser shtei oisiyos afilu b'sefer Torah tefillin umezuzas beloiz yunin gam ken chayiv. So if a sofer forgot that it was Shabbos and he wants to continue working on a pair of tefillin, or he wants to work on a Sefer Torah, and he sits down and he writes 2 letters in the Sefer Torah, and they're 2 letters that really are supposed to have tagin, and he forgets to write the tagin, he can't turn around and say, well, I never completed the letters, I didn't put on the tagin. No, they are complete letters, because the Sefer Torah is kosher even without the tagin. He would be chayiv to bring a carbon chatas. V'cholshked b'ksav ba'alma. Certainly this is true. If you're not writing a Sefer Torah tefillin and mezuzahs, you're just writing on a paper, the mikri ksav v'chayiv, then it definitely would be called a ksav. In other words, what the Mishnah Berurah is pointing out is you would have a havamina to say that if you're writing on Sefer Torah tefillin and mezuzahs, where really it's supposed to be tagin, and you didn't write the tagin, maybe you're not chayiv to bring a carbon chatas because you didn't complete the letter. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, it's not true, because the tagin are not ma'akiv. But if you're writing a letter to your friend on a piece of paper, then there's no havamina that you need to write the tagin. A get is written in ksav ashuris, and you don't write tagin in a get. So you see, it's considered a complete ksiva even without the tagin. Also, this isser of ksiva, the malacha of ksiva, is an isser daraisa, whatever style of writing you're using and whatever language you're writing in. He says, take a look earlier on in Siman Shin Vav and the Bir Halacha, where he says, we explained, that is agreed upon by all Paiskim. Because of a Rambam, numbers you might think are not considered letters. Maybe when we talk about ois, maybe we're talking about only things that make up words. Numbers don't make up words. But no, numbers are also considered characters that you would be chayiv anissa deraisa, would be over anissa deraisa, and chayiv karbachatos if you wrote 2 of them. Continues the Chavetz Chaim. Shtei oisiyos shamarnu, the 2 letters that we're speaking of l'chiyuv, hu afilu ksava b'shnei dape pinkas. This would be true even if you wrote 2 letters on 2 different edges of paper. So, for example, you have 2 pieces of paper, and you wrote let me do it like this. So in this case here, I wrote an aleph on the edge of that page, and I wrote a beis on the edge of this page, right? Now, the preface that you need to understand this properly is that when we say that it's an issa daraisa to write 2 letters, it has to be 2 letters that could be read next to each other. Now remember, we said they don't have to make a word. It could be Aleph Gimel, which doesn't make a word. But they have to be 2 letters that could be read together. That's the backdrop of the halachas that we're going to learn now. So says the Mishnah Berurah, Shtei oisiyos shamarnu l'chiyuv, hu afilu ksava b'shnei dape pinkas. It could be that you wrote them on 2 different pages of paper. A pinkas is a ledger. So you wrote it on 2 separate pages of the ledger. and you wrote the aleph on the edge of one, and you wrote the beis on the edge of another one. V'heinegin zeh zeh, so that they could be read together if you would take the 2 pages and lay them next to each other. Dahainu, sheksavan b'sifseihen, you wrote one letter on the edge of one paper and another letter on the edge of the other paper, so that theoretically, like I showed you, you could take the 2 papers and put them next to each other, and now the 2 letters could be read together. Sheyuchal l'kroisan ka'achas. Va'afilu im ksava b'shnei kosli zav yosmi b'fnim, chayiv hayil sheyuzu keneged zuv yachal l'kroisan ka'achas. So too, if you had an inside corner by the wall, right, and you wrote one letter on one side of the inside corner, and the other letter on the other side of the inside corner, so that they're next to each other. So again, they're not written on the same surface, but they could be read together. That would be an Isser Daraisa. Or even if you take a piece of paper, you take a piece of paper and you write one letter on it in Borough Park. And now you go traveling to Monsey and you take another piece of paper and you write another letter on the edge of another paper in Monsey 2 hours away. In a different notebook on the edge. Chayiv. You would be chayiv to bring a karbachatas if you did this on Shabbos b'shoigig. Because if you would bring the 2 papers together, they would be able to read. You would be able to read the 2 of them together. I'll explain this in a moment. And you don't need to do a maisa to bring them together. Let me explain to you what this means, because this is a bit confusing, and I think I need something that I could write a little. Here, I got 2 pieces of paper over here. I was never so good with the visual examples. Over here I have an aleph and a beis that are written together. Okay? They could be read together, even though they're on 2 separate pieces of paper. That was the first thing that the Mishnah Berurah said over here. The Mishnah Berurah said, if you take 2 pieces of paper and you write one letter on the edge of one paper and you write another letter on the edge of another paper, you would be chayiv. Why? Because if you put them next to each other, they're both written on the edge of the paper, you put them next to each other, they could be read together. He also told us that this is true if you do it on an inside corner. So again, an inside corner, they're next to each other. You could read them together. Now another thing he's telling me is, what if I'm in one Medina at 10 o'clock in the morning, and I have one piece of paper, and I write an aleph on the edge of the paper. And then 4 hours later, I'm in another Medina, and I have another piece of paper, and I write a beis on the edge of that paper. I'm chayiv for writing 2 oisiyos on Shabbos. Now, whether or not you're going to have to bring a karmachatos is going to depend on how you had hasra. Was it behelam achas? Was it b'shtei halamos? Etc., etc. We're not going to go into that. Obviously, if you did it in 2 different medinas, it was spaced apart greatly by the amount of time. Right? You wrote one ois 10 o'clock in the morning, you wrote another ois on another piece of paper at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Are you going to be chayiv to bring a chatos or not? There are going to be details that are going to go into that. But it's definitely shaykh that you will have to. The chiddush of the Mishnah Berurah is you should just realize that if you wrote one ois on the edge of one paper at 10 o'clock in the morning, and in one Medina, and you wrote another ois on another edge of a different piece of paper in another Medina at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that could be an issa daraisa of writing 2 letters, and you might have to bring a karbachatos. And why? Because since each letter is at the edge of a paper, they could be brought together, and they could be read together. Now, the Mishnah Berurah uses a funny lashon here. He says that this is usher And he says, Ve'en mechusar maisa l'krivasam. You don't have to do anything to bring them next to each other. Well, yeah, I do. I have to take one paper in Muncie and I have to bring it to Borough Park in order to put them next to each other. But that's not what the Mishnah Berurah means when he says it's not mechusar maisa. I'll tell you what he means. What he means is like this. What if you didn't write the letters on the edge of the paper? What if you wrote the letters in middle of the paper? So now it's like this. Now you have an aleph on the middle of this paper. You have a beis on the middle of this paper. Even if you put the two papers next to each other, the letters aren't next to each other, so they're not read together. Yes, you could see them at the same time, but it's two very distinct letters. They're not next to each other, as opposed to the case where they're on the edge, where they're next to each other. So these are read together. These are not read together. When the Mishnah Berurah says that you don't need a maisa to bring them together, he means that when they're like this, so even if one is in Borough Park and one is in Muncie, if you could get the two pieces of paper next to each other and you put the two pieces of paper next to each other, the letters are going to be read together and you don't need another maisa to make them next to each other. Whereas with these two pieces of paper, even when you bring them next to each other, they're mechusar maisa. What's the mechusar maisa? Well, you would have to take at least one of the papers and you would have to cut it, and you'd have to maybe cut both and somehow get them next to each other. So that's mechusar maisa, and therefore that wouldn't be a chiyuv chatas. Aval, however, continues the Mishnah Berurah, im kasav ois achas ba'aretz, if you write one letter on the ground, remember what we said, if you etch a letter into dirt, you're not allowed to do that. So aval kasav ois achas ba'aretz, if you write one letter on the ground, v'ois achas b'koira, and then another letter up on top of the wall, or you make one letter on one wall of the house and you make another letter on the other wall of the house. Or you write one letter on one paper and another letter on another paper in a way where you can't get them next to each other, so that you could read them together without cutting the paper, potter, that wouldn't be a chiyuv chatas, because they're not read together. Okay, we're going to pause over here. We'll continue next time with this seventh entry here in this lengthy Mishnah Berurah. Thanks so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. This list of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rosh Hashanah should send Yeshua Sefurus Panas and Shaduchim to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the BSK Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu. Amen. Be well.